Renato, no microfone.
Thanks. Sorry. Hello, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is the last day of our event and the closing panel. We will be talking, it's entitled Multiculturalism, Universalism, and Cosmopolitism, Cosmopolitanism. Yeah. And so our lecturers today will be Dr. Hannah Romã Bellini Sarno. Her lecture is going to be The Others Amongst Us, Multiculturalism and Islam in the United Kingdom. Hannah Bellini holds a bachelor's degree in film studies from London Metropolitan University, a master's degree in global media and post-national communication from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and PhD in Culture and Society from the Federal University of Bahia. She has also won the CAPES Awards for Thesis 2021 in interdisciplinary category with her thesis, Something to Believe in, Trajectories of Islamic State Followers in England. Professor Tariq Modood from Bristol University. His lecture will be Multiculturalism Without Privileging Liberalism. Modood holds bachelor's and master's degree from University of Durham, postgraduate certificate in education from University College Cardiff, and a PhD from University College Swansea. Currently a professor of sociology, politics, and public policy, School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies at the University of Bristol. Founding director of the Bristol University Research Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. Author of Multiculturalism, A Civic Idea, Multicultural Politics, Racism, Ethnicity, and Muslims in Britain. An essay on secularism and multiculturalism. So we are very, very happy to be here. And we are all expecting this panel for a long time. Hopefully it will be a great session. So I'm not quite sure who is first. Sorry about this. Okay, so Professor Tariq. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Renato. Good to meet you, Hannah. Thank you for having me. This is very nice for me because I'm actually in a conference in Paris. I'm not at home in Bristol University. And here I'm doing a conference within a conference. So that's really very nice. If you could share the PowerPoint slides, I'll begin. Good. Okay, if we go to the next slide, that's my center, by the way. If we go to the next slide, here is the title of my talk, and the next slide. So the paper, the talk that I'm giving you is based on this chapter. And if we go to the next slide. Right. So this is what I mean by multiculturalism. The idea that equality in the context of difference cannot be achieved by individual rights or equality as sameness, but has to be extended to include the positive inclusion of marginalized groups marked by race and their own sense of ethnocultural identities. It's not opposed to integration, but emphasizes the importance of respecting diverse identities. It should be understood as a mode of integration, just as assimilation is another mode of integration. Next slide, por favor. Thank you. And this is what I mean by liberalism. Now, liberalism is a very complex set of ideas over a long historical time, several hundreds of years. many liberals disagree with each other about lots of things, and there are different schools of liberalism. So for my talk, I'm using just one idea of liberalism, and I'm simplifying it and saying I'm only interested in the liberalism that meets these two features. Firstly, that it is a method of a priori universalism. So by a priori, I mean it begins with principles, not with lived experience or particular societies or countries. And it's universal because it believes that the principles apply, if you can get them right, apply to all societies everywhere. That is the ambition of liberalism. Secondly, of course, it is normative. And its normative feature is that it's centered on individual freedom or rights. Roughly speaking, I would say that this liberalism is basically what I understand John Rawls' theory of justice to be. And it is, in fact, the dominant academic liberalism in Anglophone political theory from John Rawls to today. And I want to argue that multiculturalism is limited if it has to work with this liberalism, as so many multiculturalists, like say Will Kimlicka, believe that it has to. I want to do the opposite. I want to work with multiculturalism in a frame that's not dominated by one ism, specifically this ism, liberalism. So if we could have, so let me begin. I wish to challenge the idea present in Will Kimlicka and other liberals, including liberal multiculturalism, that multiculturalism is only acceptable to the extent that it is derived from liberalism or is at least consistent with liberalism. I should say that on many occasions, the normative force of liberalism will be compelling. But we must not begin with the assumption that it must always be so. This, at any rate, is the approach I have followed, very much leaning on Bhikkhu Parekh on some points, and which has recently, very flatteringly, been identified as a feature of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. I want to offer here two arguments in support of this view. The first part draws on an appreciation of the significance of identity and some sociological research based on that. The second part is to do with the normative role of dialogue in a context of cultural and value conflict, and is based on my reading of Bhikkhu Parekh. So I'll start with the first point, the role of identities. Liberalism's primary medium is that of values, principles, and laws. One of the ways to de-absolutize liberalism in relation to multiculturalism and the respectful inclusion of minorities is to recognize the sociological and normative significance of other features of social life. The one I principally have in mind here is a sense of identity. In the 1990s, I was the principal researcher of the Fourth National Survey of Ethnic Minorities, a large nationally representative survey in England and Wales, comprising of over 5,000 respondents that was in the field of 1993-94. The survey covered many different topics, It included an innovative section on ethnic identity and cultural practices, probing aspects of minority identities that no survey, as far as I'm aware, had ever done with such a large and nationally representative sample. I was particularly struck by 4 findings. Firstly, different minorities prioritized different kinds of identities. While skin color, black, was prominent in the self-descriptions of Caribbeans, it barely featured in the self-descriptions of South Asians, for whom country of origin, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, was more important, including for those born in Britain. One significance of this was that the public discourse in which black was presumed to be the public identity of all who were not white and endorsed by the Commission for Racial Equality had not displaced the self-chosen ethnic identity of South Asians. Secondly, for South Asians, the religion of one's family was just as important a source of self-identity, and for Muslims, more important than national origins. This owed as much to a sense of community as to personal faith, but the identification and prioritization of religion was far from just a nominal one. This was to grow over time, especially for Muslims. A later survey done in spring 2006 found that while 79% of Muslim 16 to 34-year-olds said that religion was very important to the way they lived their life, slightly more than their elders, and on a number of questions, the young were tending to be more Islamic or more radical than their elders. Moreover, such religious identities could not be characterized as belonging to private life and irrelevant to public policies and resources. For example, half of the Muslims interviewed in my survey said that there should be state funding for Muslim faith schools. The third striking feature was that these religious and ethnic identities were not simply an expression of behavior, of participation in distinctive cultural practices. For across the generations, and in relation to time spent in Britain, there was a noticeable decline in participation in the cultural practices, language, dress, attendance at a place of worship, and so on. So a decline in participation of cultural practices that go with a particular identity. Yet, the decrease in self-identification with a group label, like Black or Muslim, was relatively small. That is to say, it was not anomalous, for example, for people self-identifying as Sikh or Muslim to not be at all religious. So if there's a sense in which race and ethnicity had been religionized, it was also the case that for some, religion had been ethnicized. In a way, it's a phenomenon we're very familiar with in relation to Jews, especially European and North American Jews. These new ethno-religious, what I called associational identities, are not to be thought of as passive or fading identities. That would be to overlook the pride with which they may be asserted, the intensity with which they may be debated, and their capacity to generate community activism and political campaigns. The fourth important feature is that these minority identities, various as they are, do not necessarily compete with a sense of Britishness. Half of the Chinese, but more than 2/3 of those in the other minority groups also said they felt British. And these proportions were, as one might expect, higher amongst young people and those who'd been born in Britain. The majority of respondents had no difficulty with the idea of hyphenated nationality or multiple identities, which has become a commonplace idea since then. Interestingly, later studies have consistently found that national identification and patriotism amongst ethnic minorities, including Muslims in Britain, are higher than the population as a whole, which is quite unusual, minorities being more patriotic than the majorities. An analysis of 2 citizenship surveys concluded, I quote, "We find no evidence that Muslims or people of Pakistani heritage were in general less attached to Britain than were other religions or ethnic groups." End of quote. A later survey report concluded that, I quote, "British Muslims are more likely to be both patriotic and optimistic about Britain than are the white British community." End of quote. What I conclude from such research is that minority communities and their relations with the mainstream society is not just about differential values. People have identities which are adaptable and can change, sometimes even over short periods of time, which can be very important to them and not just on the basis of conformity to community norms and cultural practices. The sources of identity can be a sense of self, a collective intersubjectivity, partly produced by origins and the past, but also by one's current location in society, how one is perceived and treated by others, and hopes and struggles to change that. Moreover, such minority identities are not monistic or essentialist, but can vary across the group, not least generationally, and are open not just to change, but to fusing or combining with other identities. An important combining was with a national identity, such as British, or growing and grafting one's minority identity into the national identity. Most ethnic minority persons thought of themselves as British, wished to be British, and wanted to be accepted as such. It seemed to me then, as it does now, that this identity data was fundamental to thinking about multiculturalism. That together with the equal citizenship and racism that I've already referred to, it was a better place to start thinking about and building a multiculturalist society and polity than to begin with the clash of values or the requirements of liberalism. Societies and polities hold together and function because there's a desire to belong. That this was not monistic, but multi-layered and cross-cutting, including minority identities and the national identity, and ought to be nurtured as a ground for multiculturalism. Societies hang together or fall apart because of the power of identities and the desire to belong, not just because of values, principles, and laws, the stuff of liberalism. The emergence, nurturing, development, and sustaining of multiculturalism, including necessary forms of commonality must be done at the level of identities and not just rights and values. Of course, multiculturalism is not value-free. For a start, the aspiration and movement for multiculturalism depends on concepts of non-discrimination and concepts of equal concern and respect. However, having established the principle of recognition or equal respect as part of equal citizenship, we should not then decide all questions, all ethical political dilemmas by asking, what would a liberal do here? In many ways, this is to go backward into a pre-multiculturalist abstract universalism. We should ask, what would a multiculturalist who was part of this society, not just an abstract individual or an unembedded universalist, what would such a person do here? For example, when we ask if one or more religions should be taught or allowed to organize worship in public schools, or if turbans can be worn by judges in court, or whether Holocaust deniers should be imprisoned, and if so, up to what length of time, we know that these questions are answered differently in the US, Britain, and France, for example. In each case, there will be some deployment of liberal arguments, but they will be interpreted in ways that fit the public culture in each country and its own sense of how to balance personal freedom, equality, the public good, religious conscience, free speech, incitement to hatred, and so on. This leads me to my second argument. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is really just, I should have showed you this age ago. So that's my two arguments. One is about identity, and the second one is about dialogue. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. And so these are the 4 points that I drew out from my survey about identity. So I've already made those points. I hope you recognize them. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So the points I'm now going to go on to make are on this slide. And basically, this section is entitled Operative Public Values as a Basis for Multicultural Dialogue. In his masterpiece, Rethinking Multiculturalism, Bhikkhu Parekh had argued that if we were to take value diversity seriously, then we must recognize that liberalism was one of a number of value traditions and positions, each of which had something to say about what makes a good life, how society should be organized, what goals should be pursued, and so on. If so, it meant that liberalism was one of the players, and so it could not at the same time be the umpire. It could not be the exclusive frame in which questions of value were pursued or through which other positions were evaluated. That was an unjustified privileging of liberalism, and such an aspiration must be given up in favor of an umpire-less dialogue between the various moral traditions and forms of life. Liberalism has a lot to offer. It was a persuasive moral philosophy, but it must also be prepared to learn from other moral perspectives. Yet, of course, most practical dialogues to do with policy, institutional rules, and law cannot be addressed by such lofty dialogue. Considering practical and policy questions, Parekh argues that every society must appeal to some values to regulate its public spaces, and he calls these operative public values. And these will vary by society, though there are bound to be some overlaps across societies. The operative public values are not all derived from a single principle. Indeed, while, I quote, interrelated, they do not form a coherent whole and sometimes pull in different directions. End of quote. Nevertheless, a practical dialogue about, for example, whether female circumcision or polygamy should be allowed must start there with operative public values. They're embodied in the Constitution, the laws and norms governing civic relations of the society in question. They reflect a particular historical and moral legacy, and so in a sense are not universal and may indeed be said to be biased against newly settled minorities and others. It means that every society, I quote, needs to periodically reassess its operative public values, and the fact that a minority practice offends against some of them provides it with a welcome opportunity to do so. In a society like Britain, the operative public values have a strongly liberal character. But Britain has its own take on what are liberal values, and this will not be identical to how they're interpreted elsewhere. Compare, for instance, how liberty and equality are quite differently interpreted in Britain and France. Moreover, while Britain is a liberal society, it's not merely liberal. It is also conservative, Christian, collectivist, and nationalist in various ways too, and this will be reflected in its operative public values. Consider the case of marriage. A pure liberalism might leave the drawing up of a contract to whatever two or more individuals choose for themselves, as the famous English 19th century liberal John Stuart Mill argued. But that is not what we have in Britain. It is liberal, what we have in Britain, basically monogamy. It is liberal in some ways and has in recent decades been more liberalized, but few argue that this liberalization should be taken to its, as it were, infinite million degree. Liberals see these matters as a clash between a universal principle such as gender equality and a cultural practice such as polygamy, especially polygamy, that is to say, just men having more than one married partner, but women not having that right, just men only. So that's, of course, what liberals would especially object to on the basis of gender equality. But we have to recognize that contemporary Western objection to polygamy is not merely about liberal principles, but is mixed up with a preference for certain sexual relations and family formations that clearly have a cultural form. Otherwise, the objection would be to polygamy, i.e. the male version only, whereas no liberal public, and certainly no in Britain, no public is discussing the possible inclusion of legalized polygamy. Everyone seems to be entertaining only monogamy, though of course we're extending monogamy to include same-sex marriage. But no one's saying, oh, polygamy, let's discuss polygamy. So the kind of liberalism that is operative here in Britain, that will set the terms of dialogue in relation to minority practices that are queried as prima facie not acceptable, is distinctly contextualized and qualified liberalism, neither pure nor the same as anywhere else. Even so, it may be thought that this is not real dialogue, as the terms are loaded in favor of the majority and the status quo. Well, yes, the important thing is that there should be the possibility of a dialogue rather than merely the status quo liberal enforcement. And where else could a practical dialogue begin? A so-called illiberal minority is likely to feel it has less room for maneuver and feel more coerced if it is told its practices must be subjected to liberalism, because it'll perceive the latter as the majoritarian rather than the independent standard. The honest description of what faces a minority here is that to defend its practices, it will need to, I quote from Tariq, it will need to appeal to values the wider society itself subscribes to or can be persuaded to share. Or, I will add, coexist with. Tariq, I've given examples of what Tariq does with female circumcision and polygamy. Let me give you an example of my own of a successful dialogue that I have witnessed over the years in relation to the protection of Muslims against aggressive words in Britain. When the anger against Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses, was first expressed by Muslims in Britain, many expressed their outrage by designating it as apostasy. When that was met with incomprehension by the media and public commentators, and particularly when that charge was getting mixed up with Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa calling for the death of the author, most Muslims began to ask to be protected by the existing laws of blasphemy. When it was clear that there was little support for the existing law of blasphemy amongst politicians, let alone for extending it to Muslims, the same Muslim activists and organizations started framing their demands in terms of an incitement to religious hatred legislation to complement the laws in respect of race. This too was initially thought by the main body of informed opinion as inappropriate for religion and as a threat to free speech. But in due course, it became law. So you can see why I'm calling this dialogue, because Muslims moved their position to get closer to mainstream British opinion, but in the end, British opinion also moved towards Muslims to make something unlawful, to create a law about incitement to religious hatred, which initially British opinion did not think was appropriate. So that's why I call it a dialogue. It's a two-way movement based on mutual learning and compromise. It was also the case that at the time of the Danish cartoons affair, several major European newspapers republished the cartoons out of solidarity, but no British paper did so, on the ground that to do so was to give gratuitous offense to Muslims. This is the kind of dialogue and two-way learning that is being described here as a multiculturalist use of operative public values and exemplifies Tariq's point that, I quote, "Since moral values cannot be debated and defended in an objective way and conclusive manner, and since it is difficult to be wholly detached and open-minded about one's moral values, the dialogues involve passages of incomprehension, intransigence, irreconcilable differences, and so on." He concludes, while a society has an obligation to accommodate the minority way of life, It has no obligation to do so at the cost of its own, especially if it remains genuinely unconvinced by the minority's defense of its practices. So that was my second of my 2 points, and I will now offer a brief conclusion, a brief wrap-up. This Bristol School of Multiculturalism does not begin with liberal principles, and it seeks to go beyond liberalism, but it exists within a liberal democratic framework of individual rights and a culture of civility and dialogue, as well as protest and radical activism. So it presupposes a robust framework of rights which it seeks to multiculturalize through continually arguing about rights and reforms and policy measures to assist disadvantaged groups or abusive individuals within groups. Some of these arguments may be recognizably liberal. Others will focus on how to dismantle racism, offer positive recognition, and meet the distinctive needs of minorities without assimilating their needs and preferences to those of the majority. There is a limit to the flexibility of identities, the flexibility of identities through dialogue. There is a limit. Special focus should be put, however, on multiculturalizing the national identity. And however, this is important for bringing people together across ethnocultural difference, which itself is essential to multiculturalism. So while a focus on identity, both in terms of recognition and in terms of fostering commonality and societal unity, is not sufficient, it is a necessary dimension that political theorists who frame things in terms of liberalisms miss, and thereby miss both what needs to be addressed and what is needed for liberal, amongst other, values to be secured. Nor do socialists, human rights champions, cosmopolitans, or localists give minority identities and national belonging the same centrality as does multiculturalism, mainly because they can be too much under the sway of liberalism. So, thank you. That is my talk.
Professor Modood, thank you very much. I guess we won't be able to thank you enough for your talk. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and it was fantastic. Hopefully we'll have a lot of time, some time to discuss afterwards, not a lot because of your next. But now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Hannah Bellini. Thank you very much for your for being here as well, and we are very we're hoping to hear from you as well. Thank you. We can't hear you.
Hold on. Microphone. Well, first, good morning to all. I'd like to thank Karini and Renato for this invitation and for making these important debates possible and accessible. It is a great pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm absolutely honored to share this session with Professor Modood. My presentation today aims to reflect briefly, and for that reason rather superficially, actually very superficially, on Islam and the British multicultural context. The discussion is an unfolding of my PhD thesis, in which I explore the life stories of 4 British youth who joined the so-called Islamic State, and how the radicalization process relates to questions of multiculturalism, counter-terrorism policies, globalization, and mediatization. I apologize in advance to Professor Modood as most of what I'll say here is definitely very well known to him, but hopefully not to the rest of the audience, and may help them become more familiar with the context from which his work has arisen. Well, since the idea of multiculturalism first emerged, it has undergone significant transformations in terms of its lived experience, political implementation, conceptual definitions. It remains polysemic, its social impact, and in relation to the place it came to occupy in the collective imagination. These changes occurred because, in spite of their differences, contemporary Western multicultural societies raise common and fairly new problems related to the nature of collective rights that include the cultural rights of minorities and immigrants, the ways to accommodate diasporic loyalties, and the diversity of modes and levels of citizenship involved in the process. Such problems are related to the equality of status received by different cultures and if they should be judged on their own terms or according to universal standards. In the case of the latter, who then should be responsible for defining such standards? What should be the role of the state in relation to cultures? How can cultural diversity be respected and political unity guaranteed? To what extent should the state be involved with cultural aspects such as the practice of religion, marriage, family, social customs, and education? Should the focus of multiculturalism be on the individual experience or on the values that are considered shared values of a specific minority groups? And finally, can political multiculturalism help to essentialize fluid configurations, or is it indispensable in fostering intercultural dialogue? As it's widely known, although much has been debated on this very contested subject, these are extremely complex questions, and I will not focus today on how specific political or normative theories of multiculturalism respond to them. Instead, multiculturalism will be considered in its wider frame, comprising the lived experience of diversity, the discourse and policies designed to deal with it, and especially the more prescriptive notion that within multicultural societies, marginalized groups marked by racial, ethnic, and cultural identities, in which religious identities and religious practice are very much included, deserve recognition and equal treatment in the context of difference. This approach established direct dialogue with that of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism, in which Professor Modood is one of the main references. Well, as the idea of multiculturalism is then better understood in contextual and historical terms, as I said before, I'll try to explore it again very superficially through the presence of the Muslim minority and its particularities in the British context, focusing on how the tensions around them relate to the radicalization of some of its youth. In very, very general terms, contemporary British multiculturalism was conditioned by the circumstances surrounding its emergence with the arrival in the United Kingdom of a significant number of immigrants, particularly from former British colonies, driven by the demand for labor in the post-World War II period. While the country needed a workforce, the government considered that the immigration posed problems in terms of social cohesion from the beginning. At the same time, the country's decline as an imperial power also challenged notions of national identity. It is possible to state that the experience of British multiculturalism and the inter-ethnic tensions that emerged are closely related to the remodeling of the very notion of British identity, which underwent deep transformations, both with the end of empire and immigration, and with the decline of the role of religion in liberal democracies. And the introduction of Islam in a British multicultural context relates to all these issues. The Muslim community in the UK is mostly South Asian, of Pakistani and Bangladeshi descent, mostly. Very heterogeneous, the community currently represents the largest religious minority in the UK, where they make up to 4.8% of the population. a substantial minority if compared to 1.5% of Hindus, 0.8% of Sikhs, and 0.5% of Jews. Also, very, very relevant is the fact that the Muslim community is the most racially diverse religious community in the UK, and the least white, and Islamophobia and racism often conflate in this context. Muslims, in fact, endure both religious and racial exclusion. Initially, however, policy and research viewed immigrant groups within a black and white dichotomy, and it was only during the 1980s that discourse on race was criticized for being too simplistic. It was then acknowledged that many minority communities did not view themselves as falling under the umbrella term black, but required more specific and complex ethnic labels. One event can be considered especially relevant in turning the focus from the racial to religious identity. That was, as mentioned by Professor Modood, the launch in 1988 of the book Satanic Verses by the Indo-British Salman Rushdie and its aftermath. The release of Rushdie's book was considered a critique of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, culminating in a religious decree, a fatwa, that labeled the work blasphemous and condemned its author to death. Although this specific decree was issued by Ayatollah Khomeini, then Iran's spiritual leader, for political reasons also, the repercussion was felt around the world, generating protests and deaths that considerably fueled the debates around the idea of the existence of a cultural clash. The decision to keep the publication in the UK created a rift between part of the Muslim community and much of British society. Questions around the blasphemy laws, which were still in place at the time, but seemed to apply only to Christianity, made the official bias of the system evident. And at the same time, the reaction of some within the Muslim community to the episode accentuated anti-Islamic feelings. The negative stereotyping of Muslims that followed the crisis was an important factor in mobilizing the minority. Even though religion became central in citizen activism and politics since then, it was only in 1996 that the Race Relations Act started to include the protection of religious and not just racial minorities. In many instances, in fact, such as the battle for state-funded Muslim schools, Muslims were often merely striving to achieve parity with other religious minority groups in mainly Christian Britain, such as Jews and Catholics who had this already. And mobilization around recognition and accommodation of the community is still paramount in British multiculturalism. As Professor Modood has successfully argued, the incorporation of Muslims has become the most important challenge of egalitarian multiculturalism in the European context. Talal Assad seeks to explain this question by saying that in Europe, where inhabitants increasingly define their heritage as Judeo-Christian, the principles of equality in political community cannot easily be extended to Muslims because they are identified as followers of a non-liberal religion. In fact, secular sensibilities play a central role in these dynamics, as they do in many battles for recognition and inclusive citizenship in contemporary Western democracies today. Once secularism involves not only the concept that entails that political authority is not subordinate to religious authority, but also a range of sensibilities that encompass both the premise that the relevance of religion would possibly be a condition to be overcome collectively, at least publicly, and for some, they would like it to be privately overcome as well, and different degrees of tolerance in relation to religions, with certain manifestations seen as a greater threat to secularism than others. And in the European and British context, Islam is still perceived as the main threat to the model of secularism derived from Christianity. Even we must admit that secularism in Britain is by no means the most radical in Europe, if compared to other countries such as France, for example. But even in the UK, the resistance to the religion seems to be growing. Some opinion polls are indicative of this. For instance, in a 2005 BBC survey in the UK, 27% of respondents said that they considered Islam incompatible with Western and democratic values, a proportion that rose to 40% according to a 2015 YouGov survey. But even if we consider liberal values as the normative framework, as problematic as this may be, taking liberal values as a normative framework, and Professor Modood has just made an excellent case as to why this is so. The question lies in the emphasis given to this specific community. When compared to other religious communities, the Muslim community is often singled out as being more isolated or for holding values especially different from the rest of the British population, when, in fact, that is not exactly the case. Attitudes and sensitivities about same-sex marriage and cis-heteronormative marriage can serve as an illustration here. For example, a policy exchange survey conducted in 2016 with over 6,000 British adults showed that 52% of British Muslims were against same-sex marriage. The percentage was smaller among young people. But another YouGov poll also indicated that 63% of evangelicals and 36% of Catholics shared the same opinion, equally held by 27% of the general population, the number going up to 49% in people over 60. So not such a big gap here. Although Jews were not included in this survey, one carried out by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in 2016 revealed that the Jewish community was the most endogenous in terms of marriage, with 78% of unions being with people from the same religion, indicating that the community could also be described as closed and conservative. Not only the exceptionality bias against the Muslim community is imprecise, but the idea that religion is an impediment to integration and political participation contradicts several researches indicating that political engagement focused on religious causes accelerated the process of integration of Muslims and contributed positively to the group's sense of belonging in the UK. Studies indicate, for example, that lobbying for issues such as halal food in schools during the 1980s and 1990s, and more recently, opposition to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, has culminated in greater community participation in the elections. Also, a study on the sense of transnational belonging among Pakistani Muslim women in Britain found out a strong sense of their value and attachment to British citizenship emerged from their religious identity. When discussion focused on the situation of Muslim women in France and in Pakistan, for instance, for different reasons, Britain was seen as a place where there was freedom from problems that confronted Muslim women in these two countries. The discourse of religion and identity is also used for internal empowerment. Studies on young Bengali Muslim women show how religious discourse can play an important role in negotiating and resisting parental and community restrictions, for example. So, contrary to what is commonly stated, in this context, and again, that could be extended to other environments, religious identity and its direct dialogue with politics, and not its opposite, could be seen as a way forward with regard to building a more inclusive multicultural society. Instead of Trojan horses that aim to destroy secular societies from within, demand for accommodation of religious needs could also be seen as indicating affection rather than disaffection. In this case, they show a commitment to Britain and a wish by Muslims to make themselves more at home. The marginalization of religious groups and religious identity, on the other hand, generally helps to empower extremists and contrasts with evidence that an European and British Islam is emerging as a powerful response to extremism, in fact, the most powerful response to extremism. The vacuum of religious presence in politics and public sphere leads to lack of religious literacy, and the space is often filled by self-appointed religious leaders who are ready to exploit the clickbait tendency of contemporary media coverage. Again, that is not an exclusivity of the UK, but seen across very different countries, including Brazil. In Britain, a classic example is Angel Chowdhury, a divisive figure with little religious credential who was opposed by most Muslims. He was given a large platform to talk about his very extreme version of Islam, frequently participating in programs and debates on the BBC, Channel 4, Al Jazeera, CNN, to name a few, where he was allowed to get ahead in the very competitive marketplace for religious seekers. He went on to become one of the Islamic State's top propagandists in the West and is directly associated with some 300 individuals who have subsequently joined the group. As far as religion is concerned, the trap of focusing on individuals who are more visible due to their extreme views and sensationalism is one that both academia and the media often end up falling into. This approach overshadows the positive elements of religion in multicultural contexts and helps to consolidate harmful stereotypes that then become the basis for criticism of the whole group. Already problematic, the discourse about Islam and the tensions around it intensified, reaching a new level after the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001 and the aftermath of United Kingdom's unconditional support for the US in the disastrous invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. After the attacks on public transport in London on July 7, 2005, the Muslim presence, already at the heart of the multicultural debate, became also central in the national security narrative. At the time, the Labour government, under the leadership of Tony Blair, boosted strategies to prevent and combat terrorism with questionable results that, to a large extent, contributed to aggravate the situation they were supposed to improve and played a role in weakening cohesion. The programs Prevent being the main one, which at first involved a commission with diverse representations from the Muslim population, carried consultations in the communities to produce a report to try to detect the main reasons that could have led young people born and raised in the country to commit acts of terrorism against their fellow countrymen. The Commission's conclusion recommended long-term initiatives that dealt with inequality, discrimination, absent or ineffective government policies, and in particular, foreign policy issues. Although these factors had been mentioned by the attackers themselves, the recommendations created a noise in the official narrative that sought to neutralize the relevance of military interventions and conveniently insisted on framing the problem through the prism of the idea that communities were not properly integrated. In the government's conception, the integration problem was related to a specific model that did not involve political criticisms of foreign policy, for example. On this matter, Arun Kundani notes that one source of stress was the expectation that Muslims, often divided between good and bad, trustful and suspect, would have to uncritically incorporate society's values in an environment marked by Islamophobia and racism. According to the author, the Muslim who sells kebabs contributes to good diversity until he criticizes foreign policy, when he is then not seen as an engaged citizen, but as an integration failure responsible for the lack of European social cohesion. Opinions on foreign policy are considered especially sensitive and are often perceived to suggest divided loyalties or even a sign of treason of diasporic populations. Once again, in this context, the assumption contradicts the results of studies that indicate that diasporic transnational mobilization, including conflicting ones like the ones surrounding the Rushdie affair and the Gulf War, for example, have been key moments in the development of a Muslim British civic consciousness. Far from revealing ambiguous loyalties or unbridgeable cultural abysses, British Muslim transnational loyalties have challenged the national polity to work for new global human rights causes, including very relevant ones, such as in Bosnia and Palestine, for example. In 2006, the PREVENT program was expanded and started to include legal flexibility that allowed for arrest without formal charges, a policy of searches in public places, and restrictions at airports. The initiative was complemented by surveillance campaigns in schools and universities, generating discomfort and alienation on the part of Muslim communities, especially the youth. Many community initiatives also had funding dependent on counterterrorism prevention, even when it came to projects not related to groups considered at risk. Often, in order to get the funding, communities started to adopt a discourse in which they described themselves as a group that was at risk of radicalization. This process having impact in the construction of the identity of their members. That was definitely the case with the young men and women whose stories I analyzed in my thesis. With the Conservative Party in power from 2007, anti-terrorism policies became further detached from the community, and organizations such as the Muslim Council of Britain, previously considered allies in the government in the fight against terrorism, came to be seen as suspect, being replaced by institutions with a different profile, some with openly hostile relations with a significant part of the community, such as the Quillian Foundation. At a national security conference in Germany in February 2011, David Cameron, leader of the Conservative Party and then Prime Minister of England, categorically announced that the British multicultural state had failed. Making reference to the radical views of some young British Muslims, Cameron declared that the UK needed far less of the passive tolerance of recent years and much more of active and muscular liberalism. Paradoxically, in the same speech, he recognized the limitations of the project of society from which the phenomenon emerged, stating that, and I quote, "We have failed to provide a vision of society to which they wish to belong. All of this ended up leaving young Muslims uprooted." Despite this statement, the rhetoric of the Conservative government did little in terms of social cohesion and with this perceived lack of belonging Cameron made reference to. It is important to point out that this crisis of belonging is an issue of political recognition or lack of it that goes far beyond religious practice, as Professor Modood has already observed. For instance, according to data from the 2007 Citizenship Survey, 45% of practicing religious Muslims stated that they had never noticed a conflict between their religious and national identities, while among non-practicing, non-religious Muslims, the percentage was lower, 35%. Non-practicing, non-religious Muslims also had lower trust in government policies than practicing religious ones. This indicates not only that individuals who declared being non-practicing, non-religious still held on to their religious identity, but that they felt this identity clashed to a greater extent with their national identity than practicing religious ones. The imperative of a choice between the national and the religious identity is central in distinction, as Muslims' sense of belonging in the UK generally depends on the question posed to them. When asked about national belonging, most said that they felt strongly British, with the combined identity of British and Muslim appearing more frequently. However, when respondents were asked to choose one loyalty or another, British or Muslim, 81% described themselves primarily as Muslims. This is very relevant with regards to the question of radicalization, for instance, as the dichotomy involved in the crisis of loyalty among Muslims in the West is central to the narrative of groups such as the Islamic State. The polarization of loyalties is an element that's often triggered in combination with the possibility of inclusion and belonging. In the process, groups such as Islamic State also offer the possibility of the rescue of notions like respect, honor, and power, a combination that can be very seductive for young people who are feeling socially alienated, being them religious or not. Since the end of Cameron's government in 2016, the political situation in the UK has become more strained. In a popular referendum he led on June of that year, the country voted in favor of the withdrawal from the European Community. The decision, which received 52% of votes, was understood by many as a declaration of nationalist fervor and as an expression of a feeling of resistance to multiculturalism and immigration. On July 23, 2019, Boris Johnson was elected as leader. Among Johnson's troubling claims, many were directed at Islam and Muslims. In 2005, he wrote in an article for the Spectator magazine that Islamophobia was a natural reaction for any non-Muslim reading the Quran. In 2018, he stated that Muslim women who wear the full veil looked like letterboxes and bank robbers. Despite this, under his leadership, the Conservative Party won the general elections in December 2019 with the highest percentage of majority in parliament since 1987. The victory of Brexit and the Conservative Party in the figure of Boris Johnson intensified, certainly in terms of speech, political and ideological tensions in the country. Especially for minorities, Johnson's election indicated that for a significant number of their countrymen, the debasement of their identity and religion was not a major issue, but quite the opposite, that an openly antagonist attitude to it was something their fellow citizens shared, or at least were indifferent to. And I think that this is something that ethnic, religious, and racial minorities here in Brazil can totally relate to. On a positive note, the escalation of the rhetoric against the Muslim minority has helped to foster debate and led to greater and more vibrant mobilization from political institutions and organized civil society around the issue. So even though to some extent Islamophobia has increased, so has resistance and opposition to it. That said, it's worth remembering that the challenges in the British context, however, are not isolated but relate to challenges faced by many Western democratic states trying to deal with increasingly culturally diverse societies and the struggles brought by fast-changing configurations in which the re-emergence and repositioning of religion as a salient player in political arenas is a major factor. It is also a period in which difference is taking center stage in questions of identity politics, when the very affirmation of not being the other is paramount to who we are. And that is throughout the political spectrum, from progressives to conservatives. Nonetheless, risking stating the obvious here, the effort to embrace diversity through inclusive politics of equal dignity, centered on shared values with openness, especially when differences are profound and uncomfortable, is the only possible horizon for the construction and weakening projects of hate so widespread today. And the ability and willingness to do so, sustaining the inevitable conflicts in politically productive ways, is a great test of our time. And I couldn't think of a better, more solid body of work than that of Professor Modood in terms of suggesting productive ways in which that can be done, as he just did now. As Renato and Karini have already observed, his trajectory as a public intellectual championing multiculturalism as a form of civic integration has produced reflections that are translatable and adaptable far beyond the British context, and could be politically relevant everywhere in suggesting how we think about national unity, culture, equal citizenship, difference, and religion. No less in Brazil, where there is an urgency for national reconfiguration and for the effective incorporation of historically subalternized racial and ethnic groups. Needless to say, it was an immense pleasure hearing you today, Professor Modood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We were absolutely right to be excited about your speech as well, your talk as well. I certainly learned a lot from both talks. And our first question today comes from Professor Karine Salgado, our host in this entire event, to whom we thank once again for putting this fantastic event for us.
Well, thank you both. It's a great contribution from which I'm learning a lot. So thank you very much. Professor Modood, I'd like to ask you a question. I agree with you. Liberalism is not neutral, and we should keep this in mind when we want to think about multiculturalism. But I still have a question. I'd like to ask you a question about this. You highlighted operative public values, and we have to admit that they have an essential role in society. However, they demand dialogue to be established in society, and dialogue requires respect, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and so on. So, should we consider the more basic values in which dialogue is grounded, universal values? In other words, in order to think about different identities and values existing in a respectful society, shouldn't we start from common values, I mean universal ones, enabling this dialogue to become possible? I'm asking because I don't believe that multiculturalism is possible without human rights. And human rights demand universality. So this is my question.
Firstly, thank you very much, Hannah, for your talk, and not least for your very generous comments about my work. Thank you very much. Turning to your question, Karine. So I ground my understanding of multiculturalism, and this is not just distinctive to me. I think most multiculturalists do it. Will Kimlicka, for instance, does it, in an idea of citizenship. So citizenship gives us many very important, fundamental political values. It gives us the idea of equality, gives us the idea of law and legal protections in law. It gives us the right of, gives us the idea of personal freedoms, though of course that's very largely a liberal idea. And of course is connected to democracy and ideas of solidarity. So the idea of social citizenship and the welfare state. And in a way, what I'm doing is taking it one step further and talking about the multicultural citizenship, not just political citizenship, not just social citizenship, but multicultural citizenship. So for me, the normative grounds, the political theory concept that's most important for multiculturalism is citizenship. You ask about human rights. Well, I have a more restricted view of what human rights are. So obviously, rights to not be imprisoned without proper legal process by the state or its security forces, the right not to be tortured, the arbitrary imprisonment. Besides issues, things like food, shelter, fundamental things like sexual relations and so on. But none of these things are strong enough to generate multiculturalism. I mean, of course, multiculturalism should respect human rights, but multiculturalism is a much bigger idea than human rights. What has happened is that some people have taken human rights and expanded it into, if you like, a philosophy, into a political ism. But it's very largely just liberalism. What is the philosophy of human rights that's independent of liberalism? The only difference is that liberalism, for a number of centuries, developed in relation to one polity, to one political system, which really means a country or a nation state, to Britain, to the Netherlands, to the United States, to France, and so on. After the Second World War, you know, with the United Nations, and of course the horror, the absolute horror of Nazism and the genocide of the Jews, liberal ideas were taken that we must have a minimum standard that applies to all states, not just to liberal states, but to all states. But there have to be minimum standards. So the United Nations can't ask states to be liberal states. Maybe they don't want to be. Some want to be socialist. Some, like I'm sitting here in Paris, some want to be a republic of laïcité. So, and it's up to them. I mean, different democracies will make their own decisions. So the United Nations can't tell people, be liberal, but it can set a minimum standard which applies to liberalism, which applies to multiculturalism, which applies to socialist states, should do anyway. I mean, in theory, I'm not saying this always works out in practice. We know it doesn't. Lots of states violate human rights. But the idea is that it should apply in international law, which is, you know, not as strict as national law because no one can really enforce it, but should apply through international discourses of human rights as if it was law. And we do have some international law courts. So that is the idea of human rights I work with, but it's far too weak to generate the kinds of equality that citizenship, because citizenship allows the generation of quite a thick concept of equality. Citizens owe quite a lot to each other. I mean, for a start, a very basic thing, we pay taxes so that money is spent for common concerns of citizens, or where the needs of some disadvantaged citizens is met through public resources collected through taxation from other citizens. Well, we don't do that for humanity. We don't do that for human rights. So citizenship is a much more powerful concept. And so I want to build my multiculturalism on the power of citizenship, not on human rights. But as I say, I'm not condoning the violation of human rights. Multiculturalism must respect human rights. The philosophy that's taken human rights and made it into a global philosophy, and there are one or two questions in the chat about this, is what we would call cosmopolitanism. So I don't think cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism are quite the same thing. I mean, they share things in common, of course, including respect for identities, or at least they can do anyway. But they differ in that multiculturalists think that national identity is important, that the nation states that people create, as long as they are democratic, respect the rule of law, of course, respect human rights, then they are worthwhile endeavors. They ought to be supported and endorsed. Of course, we must also have international cooperation and international standards, but there's nothing wrong with being committed, patriot, being committed to a national citizenship, whether it's French or German or British or Brazilian. Whereas cosmopolitans are skeptical about the value of national citizenship, and they tend to counterpose the importance of the national by what I might call a pincer movement. On the one hand, they emphasize the importance of the local, so usually they're very keen on cities and things like that. On the other hand, the importance of the global. So this pincer movement against the national in the middle, from the local or regional to the global, the transnational. And these are all good things. City identities, regional identities, even what we might call nations within nation states, like Scotland, for instance, or Quebec. These are all good things. I mean, I'm in favor of that, but I'm still in favor of the national. I don't want to see the national undermined by cosmopolitanism or by localism or what we might call sub-nationalisms or regional nationalisms like Scottish and Quebec nationalisms and so on. So countries like Britain and Brazil should still be the platform for political development and for political equality and political vision, including multiculturalism.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Modood. I'm very, very sorry to say that we have to wrap this up because Professor Modood, as he said in the beginning, very generously accepted to give a conference within the conference.
Yeah. Renato, if I may say so, I have a little bit more time, unless there's a time problem at your end.
No, not really.
So I could go on for another 10 minutes, another 2, 3, or 4 questions, and we could collect the questions together, and I would give briefer answers. It's just that Karine asked me such a fundamental question.
Yes.
I wasn't able to give a short answer. It wasn't like saying yes or no. It was too complex. So, but it depends on what questions people ask me. But we could take 3 or 4 questions together, and then I could give a final wrapping up.
Believe us, we could hear you for another 3 or 4 hours still, easily. So I will ask the 2 questions here that are directed directly to Professor Modood, which are a question to Professor Modood. Can we reach somehow an Archimedean point between cosmopolitan way and the multiculturalism necessity? I guess that's already answered. So here's a question from there's a lot of questions to Professor Hannah as well. So maybe we can hear from Professor Hannah as well. Okay, based on your presentation and given the tension between reconciling national security and the protection of human rights, what you make of the policy adopted by the United Kingdom prohibiting the return to the country of children and women who were previously linked to the Islamic State? How would it be possible to guarantee the respect for their rights and at the same time protect the country against terrorist attacks?
Is that a question for Hannah or for me?
Yes, maybe we could take the view of both of you on this.
Okay. Do you want to go first, Hannah, or second? It's up to you.
No, you can go first, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so given what I said a moment ago in my response to Karine about the importance of citizenship, I'm very loath to have citizenship taken away by the state. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it can never be done, but you would need some very powerful reasons. Now, in the case of some British people who went and joined ISIS, and some of them committed some terrible crimes. Some of them may not have committed the crimes, but they were married to men who committed the crimes, and they supported them, including creating propaganda videos in which they said things like the beheadings of some British and American and sort of Canadian individuals was something they supported. I would rather, if those individuals, if they are apprehended and they're still alive, if they were brought back to Britain and subjected to a criminal trial. We have laws that and we should carry out due process. And if they are found guilty, they should be then punished by the right kind of imprisonment. It seems to me that's what we should be doing, not stripping people of citizenship. And especially in one rather famous case, we're saying we want to strip a young woman of her British citizenship because she has an affiliation with another country as well, Bangladesh. And I don't think that's a good reason either. No, if she's a British citizen, she's a British citizen, even if she's also got a Bangladeshi nationality, because Britain recognizes dual nationality. So I'm not in favor of stripping people of citizenship. Of course, we have to take security precautions. There's no denying that. And for instance, I would not object if, in the case of the kinds of individuals I'm talking about, if they were subjected to security monitoring, to security interrogation, to find out what they knew, what they did, what they had done, and so on. Just like the police investigate suspects. Of course, these people would be apprehended, and I would expect they would be kept in prison, what we call remand, while a case was brought to court, because it would take many months for a case to be created, both the prosecution and the defense, and there should be prosecution and defense. That is what justice requires. So yeah, so that's my answer. I'm not very happy with the idea of stripping people of citizenship. We can safely bring them back, and we can show the power of our legal system by putting it to work.
Thank you, Hannah.
Well, when we talk about individuals who have joined the Islamic State, we're talking about very small number of individuals. But the message that is sent when you strip someone from their citizenship based on descent is a message that goes far beyond that specific individual. It's not Shamima Begum, it's not a specific person. It's the message that no one's citizenship, no one's sense of belonging is safe. Why is that specific person? What is the limits of the crime? Because you can commit an atrocious crime within British borders, and you'll still be judged, and you'll be you'd have the right of court proceedings and everything. Why is it different? And this is like the message is that racialized groups, racialized individuals are not safe with their identity and sense of belonging in the UK. I think the message is the worst possible message. And in a very unsophisticated way, I'll say this, it's like exactly what the Islamic State wants. It's like what they're looking for is to exactly destabilize this sense of belonging, this sense of cohesion, this sense of safety. Like, you're not safe, you're not really British. And then what does the government do? They confirm this. You're not really British. Like Shamima Begum, this specific individual, she had never been to Bangladesh. She had no connection to the country. So why is she why is her citizenship less stable than any other criminal, criminal in Britain? And that is a very, very significant case, in the sense that I think that is a victory for groups such as Islamic State. Every time democracies fail to honor the universal promises to their citizens, when they do this, they really contribute to the narrative of groups such as Islamic State. So I think it's, needless to say, it's a violation of human rights, and I hope it gets blocked. I hope it doesn't go forward, and she's able to go back and be judged as she must be in the country.
Well, thank you all very much. I could not remember Hannah Arendt's right to have rights and all that. And it was a fantastic morning, afternoon for Professor Tariq. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Hannah, and Professor Karimi. I guess Professor Karimi has the final statements.
Well, thank you once more. I wished we had time to listen to you both more. Unfortunately, we don't have it, but I'd like to carry this conversation on in other opportunities soon. So thank you a lot. I'd like to thank you, Professor Renata, as well, for being our host today and the attendees. So it's all, if you are okay, we can finish the transmission right now.